Hey, I'm Shaye Koester, and I'm your host for the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast, the beef producer's place to explore new management practices. Thanks for tuning in, and welcome to the community. Alrighty, folks, today we are talking about winter watering with James Clark. James is up in Canada, and he comes to us from the Gallagher team, but he actually has livestock of his own as well, and so we are going to talk about what water systems he uses and different strategies to help make sure that you don't have to chop ice this year, because I know I don't like that. This episode is actually a rerun from last fall, but it's really valuable, and I want to make sure that you guys are reminded of how you can be proactive about having effective watering systems for your cattle this coming winter. Now, I do want to remind you that I do have a free newsletter that comes out every week so that you get this podcast, the article, and industry news sent straight to your inbox. So just head over to my website to sign up for that. With that, let's hear from James. Well, James, I'm excited to have you back on the show again. And today, we might not be giving everyone the warm and fuzzies talking about cold weather, but hopefully we can make them feel a little better by giving them some helpful information about winter watering systems. So how are you doing today?
Cold. Well, I'm good. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well. I appreciate you joining me from the field so that we can actually see what type of watering system you have set up. And for those watching the video portion, they can get that visual representation. So I sure appreciate that.
My pleasure.
So remind the audience again briefly kind of where you're located and a little bit about the operation you run today.
Yeah, so usually I'm sure your guests are used to me being the Gallagher expert, but today I'm a rancher just like everybody else. So I'm in Eastern Ontario, a small town called Winchester. Currently today it feels like 14 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 10 Celsius. And we do a small herd of cows and some sheep. They're on the other side of the barn right now. We usually run about 4 to 10 cows, steers, heifers, whatever we can get cheap a year. And then we have our flock of 30 sheep.
Well, awesome. So can you kind of talk about, what's that biggest challenge you personally face with winter watering? And I'm sure many others face this as well.
Well, yes, across Canada, across northern US, water freezing, water lines freezing. Depending on where you live, you either have to go, you can go anywhere from just 2 feet down to 8 feet in the ground to get your water source before you're under the frost line. So honestly, that's the biggest challenge that I face, and I faced when I first bought this property, and then that a lot of people that I talk to face, is getting that water source to somewhere where the animals are.
All right. So beside you, what type of watering unit do you have there? And how does that work for you in the winters?
Yeah, so I run Miracle water tanks. Usually I have these ones on all year. I have one on this side, one on the other side, and those are for my paddocks as the animals come back. It's just an easy automatic water that I can always leave on. And so in the summer I run those Rubbermaid bins, but the one that I have next to me is a 2700. You can see the dome top. I got those ones specifically so that the sheep don't jump on top of it. It's a couple inches of insulation all the way around. It has a water heater in it. It has a water line, a heat trace that goes all the way down. So it keeps all of the water coming into it above freezing, which is fantastic.
That is really nice. So then I know we've talked a little bit about those before on the show for just in general watering systems. So are there larger ones or ones with more drinking holes for cattle, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so, when we were looking at it, my wife and I were trying to figure out how to set this up. There's double-sided, single-sided, square. There's also ones that have balls in them, the ball or floats. We figured that right next to the barn with a good wind brace, this would be plenty, nice open water, and the heat would be enough to keep it, and it has worked for us. When I was thinking about putting water out in the field, there are 1, 2, 4, and 6 ball So depending on how many cows or sheep or horses or whatever you have out in the field, and those balls are there to protect from the wind shear where you don't have any wind protection. So when we were looking at it, these ones fit perfectly for the cows that we use and the sheep. So it worked as a well-rounded option for us.
So before you had those, what type of watering systems did you use before?
Like many people, we were stubborn and we said, "Oh, we'll just run hot buckets of water out to the field. That'll be fine." But as we got bigger and bigger, obviously that didn't work out for us. So um, we started trying to experiment with, heat traces on hoses, heated hoses. And honestly, it was just, you know what, let's just do it right. And we dug the water line straight to here and straight to the other side so that it's coming under the frost line, it's heated all the way up, and then it's heated when it's in here.
Now, were you smart enough to do that when the weather was still warm enough, or was it one of those things where you had to be reminded by the time it started getting colder? Because I know how sometimes that works for all of us.
No, luckily living in Eastern Canada, you remember sometimes all the way up until the end of May. So luckily in April, when the ground was soft enough, I went, I'm done. I'm not bringing another bucket. This weekend, we're digging the water lines.
So what type of planning did you do going into like planning where those water lines would go? What did that process look like? Because it's important to kind of have a future plan in mind. So that way, if you need to adapt at some point, you can. So what did that process look like for you?
Yeah, so we sat down. We tried to figure out, is one going to be enough? Do we need two heated? Where do we need to bring? It's not just the water, it's also the electricity. Where do we need to run grounded or GFCI plugs? So we landed on two spots, best bang for our buck, and so that we could have winter paddocks. So if I can take a step back, it went way beyond just the watering. It actually went to, how are we going to winter our animals? How are we going to deal with growth? Do we want to stick with these animals? Do we want to keep building? Do we want to keep growing? And so we went for, okay, if the biggest we could ever imagine ourselves being on this property, what would we need? And it was two waters, one on this side, one on that side. So we have two wells, luckily, on this property. So we just ran the line here and then one on the opposite side, straight in the ground, get it done and over with. And the first year we only used this one. And 2 years ago, we started using the one on the other side.
Well, awesome. I appreciate you explaining that. So for people who do not have these specific types of water tanks, what other options have you seen them use to keep their floats from freezing up, even the drinking holes from freezing up? Because there are a lot of different types of water tanks out there.
Yeah, us farmers, we think we're inventive and engineers and stuff sometimes. So I've seen everything from wrapping about a fire hazard's worth of trace wire all the way around a valve, around a bucket, around the hose coming up to it, using 2 or 3 500-watt puck heaters into old those Rubbermaid tanks. There's so many different things that we can do that will be like, this will work. For me, I keep telling myself, do it right the first time. And my dad was the same way. My grandfather was the same way. Just do it right the first time and you won't have to worry about it after.
Well, absolutely. And it doesn't take much ice chopping to wish you would have just done it the first time or done it earlier. I can vouch for that one.
Well, the fun thing that I like to talk to with my American friends, Canadian friends, is, when it's minus 40, and for your listeners, that's both Fahrenheit and Celsius. So when it's minus 40 out and you realize that something's frozen, you can't even get into a latch, or you can't get into there, and chopping isn't working, running back and forth with the kettle or with hot water from your tank, it is just not fun.
No, I can imagine not. And I'm kind of a wimp. My hands get cold, I'm done for. So I like to keep my mittens on as long as possible. So is there any prep work that you recommend before winter, obviously, to make sure tanks are ready to go? What does that look like?
Yeah. So the way that I do it is in October. For me here in Eastern Canada, October, you might get some frosts, but it'll never be bad enough that you'll be chopping ice. So usually beginning of October, I take all of the heater pucks that are in each of the water tanks and I put them in my freezer. And then I plug them in and make sure that the thermostats are working, that they're heating up, that everything's working on them. I do the same thing with the trace wire. And then I run each one of them full open, no valve, no float, just to make sure that everything is working in here and there's no leaks. Um, so those are the two big things that I make sure on these two tanks that I have. So my advice to anybody who has tanks that are going to be out in the winter that are heated, test everything, because it's better to test it when, like you said, you can feel your fingers and you can take your mitts off than when it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus, if it's in the negatives, you're just not having a good day.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up today, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
You alluded to it. Plan ahead, plan for the future. Don't plan for tomorrow. Don't plan for today. Plan for 10 years from now. If you think that in 10 years you're going to need a second one, run the water line now. It'll be cheaper now. It'll make more sense in the future, and you'll have everything ready for you. And then the other planning is plan before every winter. Test everything. Make sure it's working, because if you don't, December, January rolls around, you're going to be wishing you had.
All right, James. Well, thank you for hopping on for a quick and informative podcast episode today. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the visual and you showing what that tank looks like for people to actually see what it looks like when applied to a real operation. So I appreciate that.
I appreciate being on, and always happy to participate in your podcast.
And that's a wrap on that one, folks. Thank you for tuning in today and joining in on the conversation. Be sure to take this a step further and take the advice you learned and implement it on your operation. If you want to have a conversation about it, head over to my social media and send me a DM by following @CattleConvos and connecting with me there. Have a great day.